So this is the final webinar in our landscape of early neuropsychological changes in Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease related dementias webinar series. We really thank everyone for joining the previous webinars and are excited for the general discussion today. As a reminder, please keep yourself muted. Use chat to register questions. We'll be pulling from chat for discussion. We'd love this to be very interactive, so please do engage. As a reminder, though, speakers and moderators will get the first shot at questions, but we're asking even everyone to use chat. A new feature for this webinar will be asking you, each of the participants, no matter your role, to add 1 to 2 action items in a Google Doc that Laura Germain on our leadership team has created and just shared in chat. You can do that at any time. We ask you to complete that by the close of today, as the leadership committee will be meeting early next week to finalize everything for our next steps. We will shortly, after the conclusion of this webinar, make webinar materials available, and we'll post them on the NIA website. And Ella Blue from RLA, who has been leading us throughout the process, will be communicating directly with you once those materials are available. So Ella, if you can throw up the slide deck, we'll orient everyone and begin. Great. So I'm, as a reminder, Luke Stokel from the National Institute on Aging Behavioral and Social Research Division. These are the wonderful members of our leadership team: Bob Bilder, Maya Geddes, Laura Germain, and myself. You'll be hearing a lot from them today. The immediate goals of this series were to address gaps in the types of constructs and measures beyond cognition alone that characterize early neuropsychological changes in AD and ADRD, and how to advance research to develop promising measures into usable data points to inform the design, execution, and assessment of the success of prevention trials. So all in service of these prevention trials is what we're saying. We have some guiding principles that you'll hear more about today. This is mostly focused on measures. Again, that's been the primary focus for this webinar. We'd like to link measures across levels of analysis and integrated with real-world function and practice. Consider individual differences in language, culture, and identities. We want to enable for all individuals, customize for those with different abilities, and finally develop them to be freely available with source documentation and offer collaboration opportunities for research in the communities that are stakeholders here. I had this wonderful slide that I recently came across from Winston Chong, who I believe is participating today on this webinar at a recent meeting. He laid out a framework, essentially 2 frameworks for neurodegenerative diseases. You can see up here is kind of a set of clinical and functional categorizations, and then much more complex neuropathology, especially prior to dementia syndromes, which is the focus of this webinar series. What you don't see here are neuropsychological, what I'm calling neuropsychological plus. That is everything that we're talking about in this webinar series. We'd like to do a better job of representing what we should be measuring, developing phenotypes, especially to help inform the design and conduct of our prevention trials, as mentioned. Another major theme that's come up is, as opposed to what we've done previously, today we have at our disposal a whole wealth of new measures, both objective and subjective, and also demands in new areas such as artificial intelligence and machine learning to take advantage of these complex multimodal data. So just a reminder, data are everywhere around us. You know, you can swipe them away like they're gnats swarming around your head. These are invisible data. Or you can kind of waft them in like they're the scent of freshly baked bread. We are trying to do the delicate dance between swatting and kind of wafting in here. and knowing which sense or which kind of annoyances, we should be selecting our attention and focusing on. So that's part of why we're looking to the excellent group that we have here today. Maya.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maya Geddes. I'm a neurologist and scientist at McGill. One of the gaps that we've identified is really focusing on mechanisms. So a systematic review of all NIH-sponsored research showed that about 11% of prevention trials actually propose a mechanism. So we wanted to raise awareness about two particular conceptual frameworks under the rubric of the experimental medicine approach. The first is the science for behavior change, which helps us identify measurable and malleable potential target mechanisms. And these target mechanisms can be multi-level across environment, physiological features, behavioral measures, self-report, and also the operating conditions framework, which really help identify potential moderators. So understanding for whom and under what conditions or what circumstances an intervention might be effective. So we're looking for engagement of the target. So this is an engagement moderation, and then asking whether we have a change in the target mechanism on the outcome of interest, for example, behavior change, whether this is physical activity or sleep or any other number of preventive behaviors. And this is all in service of a distal outcome. Now, one feature is that there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of an individual's response to an intervention. Slide. Whoops. Sorry. Okay. And this brings us to sort of moving beyond correlation into prediction. So trying to understand, this is really in service of precision neurology. So prediction over correlation to improve generalizability. I love this quote, I am large, I contain multitudes. So we think of the heterogeneity of responses to an intervention, not just to be a reflection of disease severity, but rather neurobiological differences among individuals in a particular intervention study. So how can we harness this variability and understand measurable neurobehavioral diversity in order to personalize the approach? And when we can build models using computational modeling or machine learning to ultimately predict outcomes and move beyond group level, ideally towards the individual, we can kind of serve our ultimate goal, which is identifying the right intervention for the right person at the right time.
So today's goals, we're going to have our leadership team review the previous 5 webinars. Next, the groups will identify 2 to 3 action items for each of these themes that were identified across the 5 webinars by the leadership team as areas for focused discussion. We have each of our leadership team members as well as moderators from the previous sessions and speakers that will be leading the discussion, but we're asking each of you to contribute there. For any action items that don't make it into each of these final group level action items, that's why we have the Google Doc. You can throw those personal, wish list items there. And then finally, we'll close with next steps. We are going to have a report, a YouTube series we'll host on our NIA website. And then future products and other meetings, which we'll advertise when we throw that whole package out. Finally, we have a ton of resources already on Box, which is shared with everyone. You can access that file there. If you have any problems accessing, let me know. And finally, I'd really like to thank everyone, especially the leadership team, Ella Blue at RLA, and then all the speakers and moderators who've really made this a fantastic webinar series. And I very much look forward to today. So, high priority questions. These were what guided the selection of the topics that we focused on in each of the webinars and continue to guide our discussion today. Gaps, opportunities, and research priorities for measurement development for early detection of for detection of early neuropsychological and functional changes in AD and ADRD to advance research and prevention trials. measurement and infrastructure needs, existing projects, networks, and infrastructure to leverage to advance goals. How do we contribute to promote brain health equity, prioritize diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in open science principles and practices? You'll be hearing more about that today, and promising approaches that haven't worked or underperformed and why, so we know what we should do and what we shouldn't do because it's already been done. These are the summaries you'll hear about now, and I'll turn it over to Maya.
Thanks, Luke. So we all know that AD is a continuum. And here we really just want to stress that we're focusing on the preclinical stage where there's no detectable impairment on standardized cognitive measures, but someone might be at risk or biomarker positive in order to prevent disease progression. So we need more sensitive measures to detect subtle changes in these unimpaired individuals in order to reliably predict clinically meaningful outcomes in cognition and disease progression. Here's just as we're going to talk about some challenging topics, I threw up the Goddess of Wisdom, Minerva by Rembrandt, to remind us that there are actually benefits in aging as well. So I just want to summarize some of the topics that were discussed during our assessment of neuropsychological changes across the lifespan. And this was with Deanna Bartsch, Chandra Reynolds, Yakil Kiraz, and Lisa Barnes. So in terms of detection, Yakil presented some really beautiful work about lessons learned from presenilin 1 carriers. She showed us tasks like the semantic fluency clustering on memory for semantically related objects, or the Mesero task, and the Latin American Spanish face name associative memory exam, which both map onto neurobiological changes and help to separate, are sensitive to detect subtle changes in cognitively intact carriers of mutation. She also presented some interesting strategies using map remote, which was validation of supervised and unsupervised paradigms in culturally and linguistically inclusive longitudinal samples. And this led to some abilities to increase our sensitivity to detection, for example, by leveraging remote data acquisition and increasing the delay on recall. We can actually see an increase in detection sensitivity in at-risk individuals. Deanna Bartsch presented some interesting data from Syntrax and asked the question, how can cognitive and affective neuroscience inform the development of measures? So there's translational capacity in using paradigms that can really be bridged from human neuroimaging experiments to animals. This is again echoed later on in some of the other talks, like Dr. Sturm's work, going all the way from preclinical to animal. One of the key points that Deanna raised was that we need to expand cognitive measures to capture dimensions beyond what we considered classic cold cognitive function. So we need to think about measuring social cognition, emotional processing, reward and motivational processes, effort mobilization, and critically decision-making. Deanna also asked questions about what strategies might help minimize the burden and enhance accessibility and facilitate implementation of cognitive neuroscience measures. We don't really know yet the parameters. These haven't been validated longitudinally. Lisa Barnes mentioned an important point that a lot of our cognitive neuroscience acumen comes from non-representative samples. So these are all some things to consider. When we think about another key goal, it's to understand and track change over time, ideally at the level of the individual. This comes both for cognitive change, but also later on, we're going to be talking about behavioral change. So it's really the intra-individual change that we care most about. And how can we do this in terms of decline, so early disease progression, but also in service of our goals of prevention here today, so measuring meaningful gains, for example, in response to interventions. And how can practice effects be minimized and or well characterized? And is this noise, or maybe this is signal in terms of changes in practice effects and how they predict disease progression? We're going to need additional stimulus sets in order to realize that goal. Chandra Reynolds presented some interesting data on measuring change over time. So one potential is to use global measures, for example, peak performance, using time to criterion models, with a slight disadvantage that you need to identify the criterion, and also the Gompertz model. One of the key goals is also understanding under what conditions can we safely combine measures across studies. On the one hand, we want to have flexibility. We want to be able to measure specific constructs in specific populations, but we need to understand whether, for example, computational modeling or some of these qualitative or global measures can be combined across studies, which is a real hindrance in the field presently. One of the calls is also to create open repositories containing item-level data and to integrate innovative psychometrics such as response theory and person-fit statistics. We talked about measures like intra-individual variability across batteries and trials. So how consistent you are either on individual trials within a particular task or across the entire battery, a measure of dispersion and another potential global cognitive measure. And a key deliverable that we really need to consider is we have to invest in new and diverse longitudinal cohorts that extend earlier in the lifespan, at least to midlife and perhaps earlier, in order to develop these culturally and linguistically valid instruments and be powered to characterize measurement and variance in under previously underrepresented groups. So that really captures some of the action items, invest in culturally, linguistically, socially, demographic, diverse databases and populations, new ways for capturing individual change, extending to other types of cognitive function, and thinking about how to harmonize. Over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Maya. The next session was focused on subjective cognitive change. So we heard from Rebecca Amarillo on defining subjective cognitive decline and its role in ADRD, as well as framing the session as a whole, from Frank Jessen on the stage 2 of Alzheimer's and how subjective cognitive impairment plays a role there, thinking about role of dyadic measures from Dr. Rachel Nosheni. And then from Jackie Mogul, we learned about daily diary sorts of methods or daily methods for understanding subjective cognitive variations in terms of impact and experiences. So overview of the sorts of questions that we were addressing in this session is how do we incorporate thinking about subjective cognitive change into AD risk? You can go to the next slide, that's fine. So this was really nicely framed by Dr. Amarillo, who helped us think about subjective cognitive decline as being potentially a very early stage prior to objective cognitive decline. So before we can detect cognitive impairment, people already are starting to self-report problems with cognition. Later in the session, we talked specifically about memory problems. And that in fact, this subjective cognitive impairment peaks right around the time that people are transitioning to a mild cognitive impairment sort of stage, and then declines after that as insight declines, as people have decreasing awareness of some of their impairments. However, at that point, we learned that partner report now becomes important, where an informant can have access to the changes that they're observing in the individual that are related to cognitive decline that, again, might not be necessarily evident on standardized cognitive tests. And so how do we think about subjective cognitive decline as enriching for trials and allowing us to detect AD and AD-related biomarkers at an earlier stage? So next slide. That way I can control it. Great. So then we heard from Dr. Frank Jessen about thinking through the relationship between subjective cognitive decline and some of these important biomarkers that are indicators of AD-related pathology. I think one of the key things that Dr. Jessen brought up is that, again, this is an early stage that often precedes objective decline, but is closely related with biomarkers that are also early indicators. So biomarker change seems to go together with changes in subjective cognitive impairment, and so gives us a further ability to be able to predict people who are going to progress to dementia, to MCI and dementia. Important for helping us identify individuals for these prevention trials. We learned a bit about dyadic subjective measures from Dr. Nosheni. So these are measures where we're looking at subjective cognitive impairment, both from the perspective of the individual who's self-reporting, as well as from a study partner. And so she talked about the everyday cognition scale, which gets at this dyadic subjective measurement associated with both cognitive decline and progression to AD. The nice thing about these sorts of measures is they're very easy to do remotely, and in combination with objective measures can be used to detect MCI, as well as distinguish amyloid positive from negative in, for instance, in the brain health registry. And so, this is providing additional and important information for classification and identifying people at risk. And then an interesting point that the relationship between self-report and study partner report seems to shift with AD progression. That's this graphic here, that self-report is particularly useful prior to the onset of MCI, and then you sort of shift to the study partner report being increasingly useful. And there is less agreement at the point that insight in the person tends to decline with the onset of MCI. And so being able to capture both self-report as well as partner report is sort of a dynamic thing across stages of AD. And then last but not least, we heard from Dr. Jackie Mogul, who talked about the fact that, a lot of these measures of subjective cognitive impairment are really capturing a single time point and makes it difficult to disentangle different types of subjective cognitive impairment. So for example, problems that are related to prospective versus retrospective memory lapses, but also confounding the frequency of lapses, so how often someone has a memory lapse, as well as what sorts of problems those memory lapses might create, so the impact of each memory lapse. And so these measurement burst or ecological momentary assessment methods allow us to capture, multiple times through the day over the course of a few weeks, how frequently someone is having different types of memory problems. And that can give us a richer understanding across the lifespan of the sorts of subjective cognitive impairments people have, as well as early preclinical stages that we, would ultimately want to be able to target for prevention trials at the earliest possible phase. And this graphic here shows the fact that these sorts of daily measurement burst methods can distinguish between people who are normal controls versus those who are reporting subjective cognitive decline versus those with mild cognitive impairment. So a little more intensive in terms of burden, but allows us to disentangle different characteristics that might be really important for prediction and ultimately characterizing progression. So key questions that I think this session really tried to address is, thinking about how do we incorporate subjective cognitive change or subjective cognitive decline into AD prevention trials? So how do we understand the relationships with biomarkers and objective performance? Thinking through, the role of the study partner, which is often neglected in these areas. So how do we engage study partners to be able to scale the use of dyadic measures, which provide us additional information that we might not be getting otherwise? And then how do we understand variations in different populations? So there's like a stray including there. You could get rid of that, it's a typo. So, this is an area where we don't know a lot about variations in subjective self-report across populations that have different sorts of challenges and health disparities and socioeconomic backgrounds and ethnocultural backgrounds. And some things came up in the course of discussion, like in those different populations, we don't know, for example, how self-report and partner report are related to each other, how subjective cognitive impairment and objective cognitive impairment might be related to each other, how subjective cognitive impairment is related to things like distress. So some action items, which we go into more in the discussion, is, how do we compare different measures of subjective cognitive decline in terms of their association with biomarkers, objective performance, and AD progression? How do we identify factors that might influence the way we measure or how the predictability of subjective cognitive change across different communities? And then finally, thinking about best practices in general, but also for things like participant engagement and thinking about dyadic measures and their usefulness, defining how we engage these partners and what are the best practices around that will be important. So turning it over to Bob to talk about digital phenotyping and measures.
Great. So this was an amazing session, digital phenotyping. We had speakers, including Rhoda Au, talking about digital technologies present and future, Jason Hassenstadt talking about measuring learning and decay with high frequency assessments, Dina Katabi from wearables to invisibles, and then discussants included Marty Slowinski and Frank Ruchitz. The themes centered on the current state of the art in digital technologies for assessment of early cognitive changes. Where are we going? When will we get there? By the way, the question after when will we get there is, will we be there in a week? But more importantly, what should we do now? Now, try to pick some highlights from each one of these. It looks like we're missing some of the pictures here. Well, anyhow, Dina talked about Emerald AI, had smart home device monitors, monitoring breathing, sleep, caregiver interactions, gait speed, behavioral symptoms, eating, toileting, etc. Interestingly, the validation was, quite impressive. There was about 98% accuracy relative to motion capture by sensitive, motion capture devices. So quite amazingly, this device just planted in the next room can be capable of picking up on all kinds of activity within individuals. homes. There were great examples of validation that Dina has done, agitation and Alzheimer's disease, and also detection of prodromal and preclinical Parkinson's via nocturnal breathing. And I think the missing image over the side was a fantastic graphic showing exactly this kind of sensitivity to Parkinson's disease and picking up on the prodromal state just from nocturnal breathing. So there it is. Okay. Yeah, quite impressive separation of groups. Now, Jason's talk focused on measuring learning and decay using high frequency assessments. The first part of this talk focused on online repeatable cognitive assessments, or the ORCA, developed by Yen-Ying Lim. This is an incredible task where you learn Chinese characters, but their team showed that you can reduce the time for data collection from 2.5 hours over 6 days to only 24 minutes in 2 days. This is the kind of efficiency of assessment that may move something from being difficult to being feasible. They also showed that enhanced sensitivity of long-term forgetting, which I think is a theme we heard about a little bit earlier, and sadly has not been used as much as it needs to be used. I think these kinds of technologies are enabling us to look at long-term forgetting, beyond the day of initial assessment. And Marty and his team shows more sensitive to deficits in groups of autosomal dominant mutation carriers. Was really quite impressive as well. And then Rhoda gave a really far-reaching talk talking about digital being the new blood, and she gave some great examples from digital voice work that they've been doing for 17 years with samples of over 5,000 people, digital clock drawing over a decade with more than almost 4,000 people. And highlighted, I think, the shift that's taking place to passive assessments. Described the neurometrics capture from keyboards, the Emerald assessment that was discussed earlier, grabbing stuff from the home, Neurocast, which is picking up information from our mobile devices. And how these can ultimately be integrated with other big knowledge bases, including things like the Alzheimer's Disease Data Initiative, and focusing really on the processes for harmonizing data, and developing further automated signal analysis tools so that the data coming from these diverse technologies can be well integrated, used together. She also mentioned fluidic digital health technologies. So I think this is another next big step where we're going to have wearable devices that will be, monitoring our metabolism in real time, picking up on biomarkers that can be integrated with all these other kinds of digital data. So really quite incredible work. Some questions that occurred to me were the value proposition for patients to engage. What do we need to get folks to be using these new technologies? Is it improved health outcomes for them, the betterment of global society, or cash? Also, what's the best balance of cool versus creepy as we use new technologies? For example, I've heard that there are people who are not comforted knowing a device is watching them while they sleep. I don't mind, but others sometimes do. How are we going to bridge that? And then I think the big question, what validity data do we need to promote widespread use in clinical settings? What is the strength and the generalizability threshold that we need to identify to enable these kinds of usages? And then a few action items that I threw out to stimulate others to think of other better ones. I think we really need community partner participatory research to really focus on the user interface and user friendliness of the kinds of work that we do in these initial academic products, and then focusing on privacy and safety standards to have clear and easy to understand data use agreements, and then to develop standards or rules of thumbs for validation, including what are the agreed upon shared target or outcome definitions, and what kind of statistical and probabilistic thresholds do we need to use? Is it a number needed to treat? To identify other clinically significant targets? These are things I think we need to focus on going forward. So with that, I think we can move on to Maya again. Thank you.
So the next session we're going to talk about was a really engaging session. We ran out of time for discussion and sort of bubbled over, so I'm hoping we can continue on with that. It was on neuropsychiatric symptoms, behaviors, and socio-emotional function. So we had 3 talks. The first was by Jonas Gedde with the same title. We also looked at precision phenotyping of mild behavioral impairment in the early detection of dementia. That was Ipsit Vahia, and changes in emotion and behavior in ADRD. That was Virginia Sturm. So just kind of going through some of the key takeaways of these talks. So Jonas talked to us about the sort of evolution of measurement of private experience, and if it's not measured, does it really exist? And talking about some early advances just by introducing questionnaires like the NPI or MBI that measure across multiple domains and capture affect, behavioral dysregulation, perceptions, etc. The presence of neuropsychiatric symptoms really increased the risk of incident cognitive decline, or MCI, in older adults over the age of 70. Jonas presented multiple models that are pictured here on the right, so proposed mechanisms that link neuropsychiatric symptoms with mild cognitive impairment. We talked mostly about the last 2. One is this idea of reverse causality, so the diagnosis of, or the sort of condition of cognitive decline preceding neuropsychiatric symptoms. While that might be the case, that there's psychological reactions on an individual level, on a group level, there's empirical evidence for a synergistic interaction between the biological model, in the case that Jonas presented was ApoE4, and neuropsychiatric symptoms on the incidence of MCI at the group level. So the sum of the risk was greater than its parts. But at the individual level, this is unknown. And Virginia came back to this idea, how does negative affect across the lifespan, for example, contribute to the development of cognitive impairment? Ipsit Vahia talked about precision phenotyping in mild behavioral impairment. So neuropsychiatric symptoms being very common at least a decade before the onset, or at least the diagnosis of ADRD, and increasing in frequency towards the disease onset. One of the things we really need to think about is how to sort of split apart some of these constructs. So subsyndromal depression, where people don't meet criteria but have symptoms, or individual symptoms, are quite common late in life. They impact functioning and quality of life. And there may be unique depression phenotypes that precede dementia diagnosis. And these are really currently poorly understood. He presented some research like the Whitehall study and others that show that specific features or sort of specific phenotypes of depression, for example, irritability, and then depression, and then insomnia, and then anxiety in decreasing order, predict the risk of incident cognitive impairment. And there's a lot of clinical heterogeneity, which may reflect distinct neurobiological mechanisms. Apathy is a sort of a nice test case that was originally lumped with depression years ago, but has sort of split off. And it might be the fact that it has a differential treatment response that has helped it to do so. Mild behavioral impairment through the use of measurement has now become sort of a feature, but again, it's really a really homogeneous bin, and we're not able to kind of operationalize some of these individual phenotypes. Also thinking about how we might move from using objective measures from the current state, which is questionnaire-based, to something that's more akin to how we describe mild cognitive impairment, where we do rely on objective features, for example, impairment on standardized cognitive tests. What are those objective features? And there might be benefits of combining digital phenotypes, so invisibles or wearables. Ipsit presented some evidence with invisibles in 3 individual patients with symptomatology to help quantify subsyndromal depression. So how might the acquisition of objectively measured behavior enhance the detection, prediction, prevention of AD? And then Virginia Sturm followed up with a beautiful presentation about changes in emotion and behavior in AD and ADRD. So emotions and cognition are inextricably linked, and emotions can be quantified across systems with objective measurements. So this is both in terms of psychological, so attention, memory reactivation, and also physiological features. So she presented some nice work on autonomic reactivity, including breathing rate, heart rate, etc. facial expression, voice, muscle, and tone. One of the challenges with the facial expression work is that it's about 100 to 1 in terms of the amount of effort of manual coding to get 1 second of video data on facial expression coded. So there's this sort of a big burden that's, remains to be kind of fixed in order for this to be scalable. And also, she showed us some nice evidence of neuromarkers where in early FTD, there was a loss of function in the salience network and a partial gain of function in Alzheimer's disease, which led to features in Alzheimer's like emotional contagion and other things. So multimodal methods are really needed in order to combine these objective measures with some subjective experience sampling. And we asked the question of what emotional and behavioral markers in preclinical stages predict outcomes. For example, embarrassment and disgust reactivity had separable underlying circuitry and were sort of markers of early BVFTD. So some of the key questions and action items. So how do we dissociate neuropsychiatric symptoms that are physiological reactions from disrupted affect regulation from disrupted affect regulation? So one is a response to loss and sort of living with uncomfortable emotions, as Jonas beautifully put it. Two, disruptions that are actually related to and driven by pathology at an individual level. And what role do awareness, vigilance, maybe even perceptions, negative perceptions of aging, for example, having a parent who's gone through a similar process, play in this relationship? And how might we deconstruct neuropsychiatric syndromes into dimensional constructs in order to map symptoms onto neurobiological systems and identify therapeutic targets? So the goal is really to integrate novel phenotypes into a system-level causal model in order to predict cognitive change and real-world outcomes. And how might we optimally track inter-individual change in emotion behavior over time? Because it's really the change for the individual that seems to matter the most in terms of diagnosis and prediction. Some of the action items that came out of this, one of the most exciting ones is the idea of planning a workshop focused on objective physiologic and behavioral biomarkers of neuropsychiatric symptoms. Jonas highlighted that neuropsychologists who are experts in psychometrics and measurement are your friend and should be integrated at every level in this development of our solutions, and it's presented sort of a nice model of personality. So some of these measures that really combine computational modeling with psychometric expertise and repeated measurement of affect and behavior in longitudinal preclinical cohorts may have the most promising avenues for future development. Another action item was to develop new methods and digital measures for automation and remote assessment. So moving some of these measures remotely is really lacking. And innovations in data processing and how people change over time really was highlighted by some of Virginia's work. So over to you, Bob, for the last of the webinars.
All right, thanks. Very exciting. So in the clinical and real world measures department, we had Kate Potson discussing advanced approaches for detection and diagnosis of cognitive impairment in everyday clinical settings, Laura Nicholas on real world measures of cognition, and Ganesh Babulal on driving real world in-vehicle evaluation system. That was moderated by Duke Hahn and Janine Simmons. Some of the core issues addressed there included what's the current state of the art in assessing ecologically valid real world behaviors? How do these relate to detecting early cognitive changes and other indicators of pathology? These labs are doing some incredible work. Kate described in her advancing approaches for detection and diagnosis of impairment in everyday settings, how they were working with primary care networks to identify how to integrate into the workflow, detecting cognitive impairment associated with dementia. It's really challenging work to engage the PCPs and to leverage, oh yes, my word processors all change electronic health records or EHRs into HERs, which is not intended. But anyhow, it's really critical to address the needs of diverse populations in this work, and how to forge appropriate linkages to care. I think this is really a critical next step in order to scale any of these kinds of practices. And Kate pointed this out very well. Also, the critical importance of repeated longitudinal assessments. How do we build this into our understanding of the kinds of information that are coming from the real world is not for the faint of heart. Kate has also done a great job focusing focusing on how to expand our appreciation of and our assessment of social and structural determinants of health. And these are such important predictors of outcomes that we really need to do a better job of routinely building these in to our clinical assessments, so they're integrated well within the electronic health record. And then she focused on how to combine, brief cognitive assessments with brain-based or blood-based biomarkers. And, this kind of integration, again, to the extent that it can come out of medical records over coming years, I think this is going to give us much improved models. And on the right, you can see an example of how, really strong prediction can be made if we can include, combinations of both based biomarkers and other kinds of primary care workflow derived measures. Lauren Nicholas did some further amazing work covering financial behavior and mobility consequences of cognitive decline. And this again is really incredible to obtain the consumer credit data and claims data in order to gain insights into people's real world functioning. And there are again many challenges in obtaining these kinds of data, and the focus on their fidelity is difficult. The diagnoses that are attached to medical records are not always as accurate as we would like, and how to refine the information that we're actually extracting from these medical records is probably a next step. But despite that, just measures like missed bill payments really preceded and did a good job of predicting incipient dementia. So I think there's enormous promise in this kind of work. Lauren pointed out many of the challenges, privacy, the sensitivity of the data, getting the appropriate permissions, and how to integrate the disparate data sets that we have. Is really the kind of work that's going to require multiple skill sets, multiple different knowledge domains to be integrated, and to aggregate and merge these data for productive use is really going to be a major challenge. So we need a lot of people who are working on engineering this knowledge going forward. Ganesh did some incredible work. I think I've got a picture here as well that we can show you. Extracting information from vehicle evaluations, in this instance, using just the kind of methodologies that you can get from devices that are used to help insurance adjusters give you improved rates if you drive well. The future of this is really going to be incredible as we get into other even more sensitive indicators that can come from the onboard computers of Teslas and other advanced automobiles. But just looking at things like GPS monitoring, number of trips, the radius traveled, distance, they did some great analyses of these these kinds of variables, and showed incredible prediction from performance measures like just overspeeding, hard braking, sudden acceleration. They could predict PET scan results from PIB. Could pick up on preclinical Alzheimer's disease, so correlations with plasma levels of A-beta, other neuropsych measures, and quite strikingly, a relation to sleep disorders. So that was a very impressive demonstration that individuals with sleep disorders could be identified well by these kinds of driving behaviors. So it's a little scary, but definitely impressive. And so some of the key questions from these talks included, what are the most promising methods? How much do they help detect clinically meaningful outcomes? Are these by definition clinically meaningful? If we look at falls, financial insecurity, motor vehicle accidents, well, those are clinically meaningful outcomes. So at what point do we validate with respect to clinician diagnosed dementia, or are these other endpoints important in and of themselves, and maybe more important? And then how do we develop universal platforms for integrating the diverse data streams? How do we improve the electronic medical record data elements so that we can enhance both the intra and interoperability of these kinds of data. And then ultimately how to balance the benefits to the individual, family, and society when we consider personal privacy and autonomy. Some people don't want to be monitored in their car or in their home, but the benefits to their own health and that of the rest of society need to be weighed as well. These are difficult ethical challenges that we need to confront. Among the action items include comparing measures with other common outcome measures and setting up validity streams that include routine onset of Alzheimer's disease, other specific biomarkers. We need to really agree upon some common data elements so that we can compare the validity of different kinds of novel measures. We clearly need new architectures to do health data aggregation. It brought to mind for me Deborah Estrin describing mHealth methods that include wasted methods. I mean, the internet probably wouldn't have developed if we didn't have a very simple standard HTML architecture available. I think we need similar methods to promote health data exchange. And then finally, the regulations, guidelines, other shared policies, things like the FAIR standards, other protections like GDPR. I think these are the kinds of things that we need to be considering going forward. So with that, we've done the speed date through, I think, the early talks, and we can move on to the next discussion. Thank you.
So thanks, Bob. Yeah, so I think we have about a little less than 40 minutes or around that time. For discussion, we've identified 5 topics and themes. Right now is a good time to add your 1 to 2 action items directly to the Google Doc that Laura shared if you were stimulated by the summaries. We'll go through, I'll try to keep us on time. So let's do a little less than 10 minutes per topic. If we've checked off the boxes and want to move forward, that's great. So each topic has a leadership member and moderators. I'll turn it over. And again, if you have thoughts, please put them into chat and we'll bring them up for discussion. I think you're up first, Maya.
Yeah, okay, so we're going to be talking about assessment of neuropsychological change across the lifespan. So I'm going to be moderating this session with Lisa Barnes and Kate. If we could also bring them up, that would be great. So I'll open it up for discussion, and while we're waiting for them to come up, one of the big barriers is, how might we harmonize across data sets? So as we start to gather data in different contexts, one of the big issues has been trying to harmonize. So we presented some ideas about global measures, but I would love to get everyone's opinion on this. Like how might we do a better job of it? Hi, Lisa.
Well, hi, Maya. I don't have the answer to that necessarily, but I would like to just say that I know there are efforts ongoing already to do the harmonization across some of the larger studies. But I think one of the big problems, and I know that I saw Paul Crane on here, so he probably can speak much better to this, is that many studies don't collect item level data. And it's very expensive in some cases, especially when you have large samples. And so I don't think you can harmonize if you don't have item level data. So that's the first barrier to overcome.
And I'll just add to that too, that as we try to harmonize across very different samples as well, we need to make sure that we're measuring meaningful, not only demographic factors, but social determinants of health. I saw Lisa give a great little talk on this yesterday, in fact, at the NAC meeting. So the Alzheimer's disease research centers are harmonizing their measurements of social determinants of health. And we need to, advanced harmonized methods for assessing these important constructs.
Thanks. And so we're talking about sort of where to invest in terms of new data sets. And one issue is really we want longitudinal, intensive, repeated measurements in diverse samples. So that's sort of a big, probably if I had to rank the most actionable of our actionable items, is we need representative samples and it needs to be longitudinal, ideally with intensive repeated measurements. I wondered if you guys could speak to some of the, wish list on what you would like this to look like. Also, how far back do we go? Should we be starting in childhood, or is midlife sufficient? How do you sort of see kind of the next wave of collection? How can we sort of do better in this domain?
Yeah, I think that this is a really important action item. And I think partnering with other cohorts, I'm not sure about adolescents. People are still developing. And so a lot of things are going to change, but definitely young to middle age, I think will be really important to capture. And, rather than reinventing the wheel, let's partner with these cohorts that have been following people from that age range for many years and add our measures to what they're doing, because a lot of those may not be focusing so much on cognition or functional measures related to aging, right? They might be doing other things. So, but we can really invest and save money and save resources by just adding our measures to what they're already collecting. So that would be one suggestion I would have.
Yeah, I love that suggestion, 100%. We have to leverage those existing cohort studies. There also, just to get to reflect on your other point, Maya, about engaging diverse populations, which have been really underrepresented in a lot of studies of remote digital assessments. So, we need to think about stakeholder engagement and participation, make sure that the research is relevant to the needs of diverse populations, and really, research new strategies for engaging these populations in this type of research.
And just to sort of follow up on that, Kate, do either of you or do any of the members attending today have ideas on how we might develop evidence around reducing selection bias? So it can be really hard to get people into studies. How can we do a better job of that? And where do we need to go?
Well, one key strategy is to not rely on the healthcare system to get your participants, especially if you want to reach diverse people. You need to have much more community-based strategies, I think. And there are lots of examples out there, people who are doing that well, but we know that, whether you're measuring cognition or neuropathology, people who show up to healthcare are different. So that would be my one suggestion.
Okay.
I did have a question though, going back to something that Kate mentioned. When we think about engaging these diverse populations, I think we also have to think about, this has come up in the other talks as well, what is clinically meaningful? Like, what is a clinically meaningful outcome? Because it's going to differ by population, by individuals, period. So is there a way that we can objectively define what is clinically meaningful? Do we attach it to a safety measure, or is there something else? Because I might not have in my arsenal something that's meaningful to a Latino population or an African-American population. It might differ across cultures. So I think we need to think about that as well.
In the interest of time, Maya, maybe we can move to the next topic. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, guys. And we can come back to points that you bring up. The themes are not supposed to be restrictive. So if things come up that are cross themes, feel free to bring them up again. So the next theme, oh, do you want to throw that up? There we go. Great. Laura?
Thanks. So next theme is on subjective cognitive change and cognitive decline. So thinking about what are the measures that we can and should incorporate, how to incorporate them, how do we increase representativeness and inclusiveness in both the participant self-report, patient self-report, as well as informant report. And what factors should we be thinking about when we think about interpreting subjective cognitive impairment or decline?
So is this open to everyone, or should I weigh in, or?
Yeah, I think whoever.
Okay. I guess I can just start off kind of riffing off of what Lisa was talking about, clinical meaningfulness. And I do think that the subjective report plays a part in that. people, it's an opportunity for people to, share what's going on in their everyday life. And also that it may be different across different people. So on some of these questionnaires, you can ask specifically about things like driving or remembering appointments or other things. And so, so I think kind of some combination of objective with subjective, I think is an important probably combination to get at some of these questions of clinical meaningfulness. And then also this idea of how it may differ across different groups, whether it be ethno-racial or other things. I think it's definitely something that we are investigating in our group, and I think others are trying to understand how subjective report may vary across different groups. And in the work that Rachel Nasheni presented and some of the work that we're doing, there's this, I think the value of study partner report is becoming very highlighted. If you're following someone over the course of AD, that you may need both self and study partner report. And so we know that there are definitely differences in who serves as study partners across different racial ethnic groups. Actually, one of my fellows has just published, got in press, where we were looking at different ethno-racial groups across the A4 study, and found differences with the study partner demographics, but actually it did not seem to have a difference in the correlation with self-report. So that was actually kind of a reassuring finding, that it's not, that they had a study partner. So that's another question, is maybe you don't even have a study partner, and that I think that is something we could talk about. But for those who participate in the A4 study, even if it wasn't like a spouse or a family member, or someone that lived with them, there seemed to be a relationship with self-report and study partner report, which I think was one of the kind of most important findings of that paper.
I think one of the things that comes out when you were speaking, Rebecca, as well as the other speakers in the session, is I feel like this is one of the areas where incorporating the perspective of the patient or the participant and their family, and the opportunity, we talk about engagement and inclusion and how to meet the goals of the people who are in our studies. The nice thing about subjective cognitive functioning in general is there is a subjective component in there that makes it very easy to integrate the real lived experiences of the individuals that are in these studies, right? And so that's hard to do with objective neuropsychological assessment, because your reaction time trial to trial is not a sort of personally engaging as the ability to tell your story. So I think it'd be great to think through, of course we want the, objective quantitative measures of subjective cognitive impairment and cognitive decline, but thinking through if there are sort of qualitative approaches too that would allow us to better engage people, maybe not necessarily for outcomes and prevention trials, but for thinking through how do we incorporate the perspectives of the participants in our research. So this seems like an area where, of any of the areas, is where it's best placed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think just that you're asking them to report on what's going on for them, that there's a place where it's kind of like you're really seeking out the participant or patient voice, and how important that is. Some of the measures that we use, you could argue we'd want to make sure that psychometrically that it kind of translates across different groups. But I think maybe if the questions are broad enough, it invites people to share what's going on subjectively in their everyday life. And it's not as prescribed as an objective measure.
Any other comments or thoughts from other folks in the groups on this topic?
If not, maybe we can move to the next. Do you want to keep going, or do you want to move to the next topic?
If folks have any other thoughts, please put them in the chat or in the Google Doc. The conversation can continue in that respect too.
All right, so we're ready to move on to psychometrics and representation, which in some ways continues what we've been talking about. And is Yakil there? I see a box with Yakil.
Yes, I'm here. Hi, how are you?
All right, how are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Good, good. So I think that there are a couple of points that have already been thrown into the Google Doc, including issues about, language, desperate need to get better normative data on neuropsychological instruments in different languages, education, how to develop appropriate assessments for individuals with low educational levels, low literacy skills. And I think for all of these, we clearly need to have assessments of measurement invariance to know whether we're measuring the same things across these different variables. But Yakil, what do you think are the most critical needs?
I was actually the one who wrote the first two.
I thought you might.
I think that the linguistic considerations are key, but as you say, like not just like translating instruments from one language to another one, but just also making sure that we are measuring the same constructs across different languages. So definitely the measure of equivalence is important as well. But then just thinking about like being as inclusive as possible. So I think that language is definitely key. And also something that we sometimes forget is also that many of the measures that we use are also requiring a high levels of literacy skills. So like making sure that we develop or even like adapt the measures for individuals that have low levels of education. So I think that is very important. That's something that I have seen with the participants that I have, that most of them have low levels of education. So trying to be aware that we need to make sure that those individuals are also included. So like low levels of education are key. And as it was mentioned before, like I think that also trying to make sure that we are thinking or having more remote assessments, so that we can also be sure that the ones that are in rural areas can also have access to everything that we're doing in the future. So I think that those were the more important things that I can think of.
Well, that's really great. And I love the idea of having the adaptive stuff. There's been such, sparse use so far of computerized adaptive testing based on item response theory. And I think that's just an essential element. And now that we have the tools available, wouldn't it be great if we had big item banks from which we could actually go in different directions based on the characteristics of the individual, based on their education, their linguistic competency, and that we then select item sets that, are actually appropriate to measuring the construct in that group of people. It could even be done internationally. So that, I can imagine, we've talked about this for like picture naming, having an international item bank of pictures that would, if you happen to be in sub-Saharan Africa, it would move to pictures of things that those of us in Los Angeles have never seen. And I love that, African neuropsychological battery, for example, that uses that kind of stimulus sets. I wonder, I also wanted to call out Kate Posson on the SDOH issues and how we can think about moving beyond the current way a lot of neuropsychology is done, using stratified norms to try to determine what is the expected level of neuropsychological performance. And I see Duke over there in the corner. I know a bunch of you probably have ideas about this, but I think one of the directions we're trying to move in National Neuropsychology Network is to really beef up our assessment of social and structural determinants of neuropsychological functioning, so that we're creating on-the-fly predictions for each person, not based on like NIH categories of race and ethnicity. I think that's really holding us back from making better assessments of what someone's functioning should be, whether their observed performance deviates from that. So I wonder if folks have thoughts about that.
I guess I'll offer a comment, and I hope Duke or others might comment, because I think this is an area where a lot more research is needed so that we can identify what are those social factors that most robustly predict baseline neurocognitive abilities, and that can be efficiently measured, because we need to think about tools that will ultimately be able to be used in busy clinical or busy research workflows. And that also, will be ethical to use as well. So, as we know, the use of these race bins has proposed some ethical challenges for our field. So that needs to be a really big area of research as well. So yeah, I think we, just like we were hearing earlier from Lisa, that we can build on these large cohort studies by adding our cognitive measures. I think that we need to be doing the same with, and I think we are doing the same with social determinants of health. There's been a lot of progress in doing that in the last few years.
Yeah, I agree with that, Kate. That's why we wanted to incorporate the social determinants module in the NAC data set, because we can not only couple those determinants with cognitive data, we have a wealth of imaging and biomarker data, which I think is going to be crucial, because we know all the challenges with cognitive testing and minoritized populations. This will allow us to see if these social determinants are predictive of some of the underlying pathology that we can measure either in the brain or in the blood, and look beyond cognition. So a lot of work to be done, but really exciting time.
And I'll just share
Folks, thank you,
quickly,
Lisa.
I agree with there does need to be a lot of work that needs to be done on this particular area, and with respect to cultural relevance. And I think I can share this openly, that I'm a part of the American Psychological Association Task Force on Race Norming, and there's, I think, going to be a lot more focus on this issue actually coming in the near future, but not a lot I can openly share just yet. But there's absolutely a recognized need for this, and for this to be addressed in a very programmatic and formalized way.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I have in the top row, Yakil, Kate, Lisa, and Duke, who may not have this opportunity to have these experts all in the same place again soon. I'm wondering, what do you think, given the spectrum of SDOH that currently sit on our electronic medical records that are available, what do you think we're missing? So, for example, quality of education is a variable that's, turned out to be pretty important in some neuropsychological prediction studies, but I'm sure there are other variables, aspects of linguistic competence and linguistic competence across different languages, acculturation factor. I'm just wondering what kinds of variables you think we're missing and we should be focusing on.
Well, my vote would be for discrimination. We have tons of studies showing that discrimination is an important factor for cognition and other adverse health outcomes. And it can be measured across race and ethnicity, including among white populations.
Great.
You guys have others.
I think Promise, I agree. And zip code based metrics are efficient to capture and tell you a lot about the community in which the person lives.
Especially for the Latinos and even for some of the other groups, like some measure of history of immigration, because I think that it's not the same, the ones that were born in the US versus the ones that just arrived to the country. So somehow I think that we should be doing a better job documenting that.
And also, Bob, you mentioned quality of education. It is important, but I have not seen any really, measures of quality of education. If people know of them, please let me know. But that's something where we really could do more work to get more. We know there's measures of like the school resources and things like that, but I don't know how robust or available that is across people, across states.
Right. And it's rough. I mean, I know, you certainly, familiar with Jen Manley's assessments, but yeah, that's, their hard work going and figuring out what they think was the quality of education. I've seen some other stuff that has come out of, the school-based metrics, when they've got national standardized testing and things like that. But, that's a, questionable proxy, I guess, but maybe a step in the direction of looking at quality. Maybe there's other on-the-fly measures we could do to assess people. Other issues. Oh yeah,
we might want to move to the next one. We're just in the interest of time.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
So Bob, this is you again, and Laura and Rhoda. Rhoda, maybe you can jump in. You haven't we'll get some new voices and faces into the mix here.
Sure. So I mean, actually, while I was listening, one of the things that comes to mind in listening to all the different comments and the suggestions and stuff is we need to be very clear on what problem we're trying to solve. And when I listen, I hear different solutions for different problems. So, so for me, for instance, I think about now dementia as a life course, and that means across the entire lifespan. I think about maximum inclusivity, that's beyond the US. So I think about globally. And consequently, that really makes me rethink, what am I trying to do and how am I going to try to do it? Because in order to make it relevant for the problem that I'm looking at, a lot of, for instance, some of the things we discuss here, even things like zip codes and education, they just don't exist as concepts in the same way when you start to think about it in very low income countries. The other thing that I think about is, I think we need to separate the concept of testing versus assessment. They're not the same thing. Actually, testing is a form of assessment, but there's actually lots of other ways to do assessments. And I think about, how do we do assessments in a way that's globally relevant? And that's where a lot of, I think about technologies, and I think about mobile applications, and I certainly think about ones that are smartphone driven. So I think that, whenever we talk about testing, we're already putting parameters around what we can do, how we're going to do it, how often we're going to do it, et cetera. And that's very different for me from the concept of trying to do assessments in a real world context, where you're taking on multitudes of different kinds of information from all sorts of different sources. They won't be the same, and they won't be, they won't be in the same combinations. There's nothing going to be consistent, I think. And it's thinking about, how do we assess based on a myriad of different kinds of informational inputs in order to get to the kinds of assessments we're trying to do, which is different than testing, which gives us derived measures. That's just a general comment.
Great. Bob, I don't know, or Laura, if you guys had other things you want to.
Laura's been uncharacteristically silent, so
I've been trying to feed
I've been talking to
the Google Doc that people have been saying too. So I'm the anonymous, one of the animals, I don't know. So yeah, I mean, it's a really good point that you bring up, Rhoda. I think especially in this digital phenotyping space, where there are digital phenotyping solutions that are very well suited for a local, in sort of deep phenotyping sort of context that would not be scalable for global research of any kind, let alone applications into clinical care, right? And so, especially I think here, where it goes from everything, like you think of the Emerald device in the rooms, right, that Dina talked about, all the way to, highly scalable, remote assessments that are brief and can be done quickly. These are very, very different problems that these two different solutions solve. And so if you build a predictive algorithm, let's say, that does a really good job at identifying people for prevention trials, for one context, it won't necessarily translate to the other. And so, we could then infinitely fractionate things, but having this sense of like, there's not one solution for every problem, and the global problem is very, very different from a local problem. So I think for this session in particular, that's a good sort of framing perspective when we think about action items. There's not one set of action items that will solve all purposes, for sure.
Right. And I really do want to encourage us to think about the difference between testing and assessment.
Right.
Because testing, no matter what you do, it doesn't matter how frequent, it doesn't matter whatever, it involves active engagement. It's very different from what we're talking about, passive engagement. I love Dina's stuff. I'm using it, we're using it in our studies, but it doesn't scale. And most people don't have broadband when you start to look globally. And so that's not a workable solution in the long run. The other thing that I also want to do is say, we don't have enough voices in the room. We don't have enough creative voices in the room, because we still tend to be a little bit paternalistic, I think, in terms of who we think can be doing this research and how we should be doing it. And I think that we need to be, that's where we come, this is the whole concept of open data sharing, is because we need to invite lots of different perspectives into the room, and we need to bring ones that are very different than the ones that are even in this seminar. Because I think, anyway.
Rhoda, I was going to ask you, so I totally agree. I mean, that was a major point of discussion amongst the leadership team over several projects, including this one. But so any suggestions for how to engage communities that are not typically represented? It sounds like in part you may also be kind of alluding to more of a citizen science-y kind of model for doing things. So yeah, if you have yeah, some good examples of how that's been done well, I think that the group would really benefit from that. And then once we go to you, I think we're going to have to move on to the next topic, just in the interest of time.
Sure. I mean, there are lots of creative ways to do what you would call data challenges. So one is creating the data, right, the data resource, and then finding ways to open it up. So the X Prize is obviously one example of doing that, but you need to do it, I think, we need to figure out, and I don't know that I have the answer, but we need to figure out how to get it to the broader audience. I just had a conversation actually when I was at the ADRC meeting with someone who was talking about how they were looking at different ways to do RNA folding, patterns and understanding, interpreting, and solutions. And they opened it up as the gamification exercise challenge. And the best person to produce a solution was a mechanic in a garage who happened to just do this on the side of interest, and that beat out their scientific group. That really struck me, that no one would have identified this person as possibly, but they opened up the challenge, right?
Awesome. Yeah. And we just recently closed an RFI for a challenge on early detection, monitoring, prediction in AD and ADRD. The challenge itself has not been advertised yet. But thank you for giving the pitch for an opportunity that will be out there. And it's really going to be targeted to people outside of the usual suspects and the usual data sets, to do the kinds of things that you're saying, to find new data. And most importantly, there's going to be a strong focus on DEIA and representation, as our data sources are obviously biased in all the ways we're talking about, and we need to do a better job. So how do we do that? So yeah, anyway, you can look there. I shared the link. Let's move on. Actually, can we go to the behavioral neuropsychiatric session? I know we wanted to have a lot of discussion there. So I don't want to hold that group up, and we have a little less than 10 minutes, or a little more than 10 minutes.
So I think this is also IPSIT Vahia. And we can actually remove the document, and if you want to bring IPSIT up, that would be fantastic. So, we really talked about in this space, trying to bring in objective measures, but struggling with, the amount of labor it is to sort of score some of these measures. Also trying to overcome validation inertia. So especially clinically, these types of objective measures really haven't been incorporated. And IPSIT, you mentioned this is really like a systems level problem. Can you sort of speak to some of the challenges that we might have in this area and some of the opportunities as well?
Sure. I'll just say I have psychometrics envy from my neuropsychologist colleagues, because we're light years ahead when it comes to quantifying cognition, and I think behavior is just it's far behind, because we haven't had the tools to really quantify behavior objectively and in these chronologically dense ways until quite recently. So I think the fact that we're talking about behavior in a forum like this actually represents quite a gigantic step forward. I tend to approach this from sort of the clinician perspective as well, because I spent far too much time in the clinic, and I think what we see in clinical reality, which is what it comes down to in many ways, because that's one set of sort of the final consumers of the work being done by the people here, is that cognition and behavior are sort of almost on par when it comes to determining sort of real world clinical outcomes, but even just treatment and management strategies. So I think several excellent points were made. You alluded to it, Maya, where Jonas said that we need to kind of put our neuropsychologist colleagues at the table in prominent positions when discussing behavior and mental health, if you will, because I think a lot of this work and a lot of the cohorts lie in the mental health, the geriatric mental health space. I mean, I'm biased, I'm a geropsychiatrist. But I think what we don't have is the sort of refined quantification of behavior with well-validated psychometric properties and standardization. So, we talk about depression, but what is depression anyway? Like, our gold standard tool has 9 different categories in it, all of which are completely heterogeneous. So I think this is an area that is far less mature than some of the other groups have discussed. And there's a fairly urgent need to play catch up. I think even just standardizing definitions and then moving towards phenotyping this entity of mild behavioral impairment, which, while giving a label and a definition to the idea that early behavior changes can co-occur with early cognitive changes or even precede them by 4 or 5 years, I think that's a big step forward. But there's still far too much heterogeneity for it to be truly precise. And I think making steps towards even deconstructing the entity of MBI into things like, I'm making this up, but apathy or apathy specific to pre-dementia or apathy specific to vascular changes. I think the power is there and the potential is there for these tools once we have enough data to actually phenotype these things. I think there's sort of anecdotal clinical evidence that these are different entities, but the research hasn't caught up with it, and I think it needs to.
Yeah, those are great points. And, we really have focused actually on sort of more detection, but in terms of, bringing this back to the clinic, as you're saying, what are your thoughts on sort of twofold? One is, the most promising measures. So, you presented some invisible data in a few patients, but mentioned that might not be quite ready for prime time. What do you think are the most promising measures? And also, as we move to remote diagnostic assessments, this was sort of, championed by COVID when, we were actually being able to offer people access to diagnoses. What measures might be administrable remotely, if any?
Yeah, I think the quantification of motion, that's sort of the area that pops out, and that's a very broad umbrella. But once we have very powerful tools and analytic methods to quantify motion, along a few different grids. It's one where the NIMH RDoC model actually is a very useful paradigm. But there's a lot of biomarkers that we're starting to extract just from fairly straightforward gyroscope or accelerometer data. Even it does not have to be very early stage technology. Voice is getting attention. Luke's point is well taken. I think the need right now is just to collect big data sets of motion data, of voice data. We're not sure whether physiological measures like respiratory rate or heart rate. I think it's still sort of the big unanswered question. But I think once we start to build these repositories of data, digital data, from which we extract these suites of biomarkers and analyze them, and sort of look at it in the clinical context, I think that's where the future lies. But somewhere between motion, voice, physiological parameters, I think lies the answer.
I also want to open it up to questions from anyone here within the group. And if any questions that you want to pose.
I'll put an open question out of the group. I think there's the two big challenges are, one, the heterogeneity of some of these entities. Like we don't even have the right nosology for some of it. And the second is the noise issue. I think it's easy enough to deal with noise when it comes to extracting findings from a research data set, but it's a far bigger problem when it comes to making that next translational leap to actionability. So I think the noisiness of some of these really large and heterogeneous data is a big one.
Yeah, and speaking to the noise, I don't know if Marty Slowinski is here, but he has some nice work looking at fluctuations on a sort of a far shorter temporal time course. So, it may be noise, and whether it's signal or not remains to be determined. For example, can some of these fluctuations be applied to teasing apart differential diagnoses like Lewy body, for example, where a cardinal feature of the disease is cognitive fluctuations. We really haven't, quantified that in any meaningful way, beyond sort of the classic clinical description.
So I'm here. I just was like, I have nothing to add. That was very well said, Maya. And just there's, I think, a lot of opportunity for trying to understand short-term variability and see how it maps onto important phenotypes. Yeah, thank you.
And we're getting close to time. Yeah, so if anybody has one last point. We'll close with Laura kind of closing us out, and then I will let us know about next steps, and then we'll close the discussion, which has been amazing. Any final points that anybody would like to bring up for discussion? Can be on any of the topics that we had highlighted. Any plugs for any work? This was a podcast. We would be asking for those plugs. Great. So Laura?
The podcast is the next initiative, right? That's
Yes.
that's coming later.
Our
So
podcast.
to close us out, I mean, I think, this group came together to think about one very big problem, which is how do we identify individuals for AD prevention trials? How do we detect changes early in neuropsychological plus sort of characteristics? How do we do it in a way that is going to include historically excluded populations and make sure that we do it in a way that applies, broadly, especially to those who have the greatest burden of dementia now and in the long term. So, a few key things come up. We've talked about harmonization being a key issue, and how do we harmonize across different studies? How do we both define consensus things that can be used broadly, but also allow the flexibility for innovation and, measures that might come from certain problems or certain communities that are not well represented in, the majority sort of view. So we certainly don't want to just do consensus things, and, creating an ecosystem in which all those things can be true. Reliance on multimodal data is a huge theme that I think has come out of this, is that we're not going to have one measure of, cognitive change. It's going to be some traditional thing. It's going to be some combination of signals, and the specific combinations might vary by different populations and by life stage. We've talked about a lifespan perspective being really, really important here. And then I think Rhoda brought up an important point about, thinking about a local versus global perspective, and what are the solutions that are going to be scalable globally versus those that are going to rely on more intensive measurement, maybe in a smaller group or local community. And what does that mean for the sorts of problems that we're targeting? So I think the one thing that I wish we had more time to discuss, and maybe that's another thing, is this idea of community-based partnerships. So I think we kept touching on it, and we kept going a little bit into it. And, what does it mean to have a community-based partnership in research? Does it mean, just including those people as research participants after having a single focus group meeting? Or are there situations in which a community is leading a research question and they're defining what the most important problems are, and then we're lending our methodological expertise to solving those problems? And so, I urge people to please go to the Google Doc, and any thoughts that you don't think were captured here, or any thoughts where they were captured here and you just want to amplify it. If it's already there and you want to put it 2 more times, go for it. I think this is something where more is better, and we want to hear as many voices as possible. These sorts of settings are not always the best for everyone to express their views. And so hopefully the Google Doc gives us one more way of getting at the sorts of expertise and insights that this group has in thinking about the future. So thank you again for everyone who has participated in this, our leadership, folks at NIA, moderators, speakers, and all of you who have contributed your thoughts.
So thank you, everyone. We're at time, and we'll be in touch with next steps and other materials. Close out those 1 to 2 action items by the end of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Right. Thank you.